Now, on the Georgia vote, we sit down with Doug Collins, one of multiple Georgians in the Trump administration, and ask him about the future of the department that serves our nation's veterans.
And we're in the final days of this year's legislative session. What's left for state lawmakers to do?
You can break my arm, but when you hurt your feelings, that's tough.
A Republican legislator votes against the governor's signature bill and says he's already paid the price. All right now on the Georgia Vote.
From the 11 Alive studios, this is the Georgia Vote with Faith Jesse and Zach Merchant.
Hey, good Sunday morning. And on this Sunday, we are counting down to Sine Die on Friday, the final day of the 2025 legislative session.
And you can be sure the Gold Dome, it is going to be a beehive of activity this coming week as lawmakers make a final push for their priorities.
That's right, and that includes the right to in vitro fertilization here in Georgia. So this was a bipartisan effort that passed both the Senate and House this week. House Bill 428 establishes that any future legislation in the Georgia Code cannot prevent a person's ability to obtain IVF. Other bills that are drawing attention, a Republican-sponsored proposal to ban abortion in Georgia entirely. It has yet to even receive a committee vote, but it could return next year, which will be during an election season. And speaking of elections, two bills moving forward would ban absentee ballot drop-off the weekend before Election Day and give cities the choice to allow early voting on Saturdays. Well, when it comes to the rest of the session, I asked Doug Richards from our political team to look into his crystal ball. What are you watching for in the next few days before Sine Die?
Well, there are a lot of divisive bills that are still out there that particularly pertain to transgender folks. There is a women's sports bill. There's a puberty blockers bill. There are a couple of other bills. They all flew through the Senate, or more or less flew through the Senate. They had not all passed the House, and my guess is that they probably all won't pass the House. They may not even get a vote, or at least some of them may not get a vote. Speaker John Burns was definitely interested in the women's sports bill, which is SB 1, but the others, including the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, others that have come out of the Senate that are very sort of divisive and ideological, the House tends to cool down on issues like that. I'm not saying they're not going to get votes, but they won't get votes if there are not enough votes to pass.
Thanks to Doug for that. And as we near the end of this 40-day session, stay with 11 Alive all week for Doug's reports from the state capitol leading up to Friday's Sine Die. You can watch on 11 Alive Plus as well. Well, the Department of Health and Human Services, led by Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., plans to cut 10,000 full-time jobs across several agencies, which includes the Atlanta-based CDC. So in total, the CDC will decrease its workforce by about 2,400 employees. Now, according to a senior spokesperson from the HHS. Georgia Congressman Rich McCormick, a Republican, talked with a CNN reporter shortly after this announcement.
So there's a lot of redundancy in staffing. I'm not concerned until I see who's being cut and seeing what's being cut.
U.S. Senator Jon Ossoff also weighing in, saying, quote, the Trump administration's war on the CDC continues with more reckless mass firings of thousands. This foolish attack on America's preeminent public health agency leaves Americans exposed to deadly outbreaks.
And the questions about job security, they are not limited to the CDC. Former Georgia Congressman Doug Collins now serves in President Trump's administration, leading the Department of Veterans Affairs. In this week's Sunday Conversation, we asked the VA Secretary about the future of the tens of thousands of employees now under his leadership. There was an Associated Press report earlier this month that indicated that the VA is now planning about 80,000 job cuts. Is that true?
President Trump was elected to make generational change in Washington, and that's what he set out to do. And one of those issues was decreasing the size and scope of our government. They set targets. I mean, if you don't have a target, then you're not going to ever get anything done. And one of the targets was about 15%. Now, the goal, which would be about 70, 80,000, if you looked at it, which would be pre-COVID levels, is a goal. and we're going to look at it and see what we can get to, see what maybe makes it more efficient without ever compromising our patient safety and our patient health, and also our disabilities benefits claims. One thing that's not a part of that is there's been no discussion at all, and will not be, of cutting healthcare benefits or disability benefits. Those are just not on the table.
I was looking at some data, internal VA data, and this is on your site. Veteran trust in the VA back in 2016 was at about 55%. At the end of last year, it had risen all the way to about 80%. That's a lot of progress over roughly 8 years. Do you worry that if these big cuts are implemented, that will undo some of that progress?
No, not really, because a lot of that increase came under Donald Trump's first administration as we were going forward and look for it. But look, 80% is great, but 80% is still 20% that we're not getting that trust and factor that we really want to see. So there's room for improvement. Look, we also have a GAO report out there that says we're still on the high risk list, and that's high risk susceptible to fraud, waste, and abuse in patient care. We still have areas in which we need to improve. And what we've seen in the last few years is just throwing sometimes money or people at that is not the best way to go about it.
I think some people who watch this interview might hear what you're saying. They might nod along and say, yeah, efficiency is good. We don't want fraud. We don't want abuse. But they might be looking for a little bit more clarity. When you're looking to make these potential cuts, how do you make that distinction? Who stays and who goes?
Well, it's really simple. What we're looking at is to make sure that no one is taking care of our veterans in our healthcare side and doing our disabilities claim are going to be touched. Those frontline workers are the people that are actually, doing the work that actually do the forward-facing, as we said, putting the veteran first. But that doesn't mean that I can't look at a management system in which we have layer upon layer of nurses and doctors and others who are never seeing a patient, who are simply moving paperwork around. Wouldn't it probably be better to put them back in the clinics and the hospitals so that we can decrease our patient load? We can actually increase efficiencies so that they get better health care? Or is it better to have a bloated bureaucracy that really has no purpose except to fund and to facilitate the VA itself?
If I'm hearing you right, is what you're saying right now that it is your promise that no VA employees who are involved in frontline, person-to-person patient care will have their jobs impacted?
Yeah, and look, this is the one thing, and I can't express over and over again. The very essence for the VA is to take care of veterans and to take care of them and their disability benefits. We're going to do everything we can to strengthen that, while at the same time finding more and better uses, not only through our contract resources, but also through our employment issues.
There was an Inspector General report that came out earlier this year that found that 2 years ago in 2023, the Atlanta VA Medical Center dropped or didn't answer tens of thousands of calls for help. Many more people who were calling into the Atlanta VA were left on hold for a long time. When you read that report, what was your reaction? Is that acceptable?
Well, it goes back to this whole interview. Again, we bring out things like that, which is not acceptable by any metrics or any standard. And yet that is what was going on. But yet from some of the same people that's, pushing back against, our change and, putting the call centers and putting those at the forefront are saying, oh, you can't do that, even if it meant, making better service. The sad part about this was it took an IG report to actually get this fixed. The Atlanta VA has now put the positions in place to have gotten this fixed. I've been on the job about 6 weeks now. We're making sure of that. I've already started meeting each week once and more with our hospital. So we're trying to get a better handle on making sure that these kind of issues aren't brought to us in an IG report. That's not acceptable to me, and it's not acceptable to the American people.
To see the full conversation, including Secretary Collins' defense of efforts to roll back DEI initiatives inside the VA, look for our full interview streaming right now on 11 Alive Plus. Much more to come this morning. A conversation with a Republican state lawmaker who said he is paying the price for going against his party.
And later, our voice of the voter is amplifying Black filmmakers on the big screens and the little ones, too.
A Georgia senator is one of many lawmakers asking tough questions of Trump administration officials after a journalist was invited to a group chat on the Signal messaging app where top government officials were discussing plans for strikes on Houthi rebels in Yemen.
That's right. So Senator Jon Ossoff, a Democrat, he grilled security officials this week and pulled no punches.
This is utterly unprofessional. There's been no apology. There has been no recognition of the gravity of this error. And by the way, we will...
So these comments from the senator came during a Senate hearing with the CIA director and others. President Trump says he stands by his national security team and called the controversy a witch hunt.
Plans to prosper you and not to harm you, and plans to give you a hope and future.
Yes.
Thank you. I love y'all, every one of you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. That's all.
That is State Representative Vance Smith quoting the Bible in a speech from the House floor days after a major vote he says cost him his job. He voted against fellow Republican Governor Brian Kemp's top priority tort reform legislation. A day later, Smith says the board of directors at his workplace in Harris County fired him. On March 20th, SB 68 comes up for a vote. It passes by the narrowest of margins. You are one of a few Republicans who votes against SB 68.
Right.
Less than 24 hours later, you find out that you've lost your job as president and CEO of the Harris County Chamber of Commerce.
Right.
What was going through your mind when you found that out?
I was very shocked. I'm a homegrown guy right there. And it's kind of devastating to me and my wife especially. That's tough, you know. You can break my arm, but when you hurt your feelings, that's tough.
And the executive committee, members of the executive committee told you, because of your vote on SB 68, your services were no longer needed leading the chamber.
It was more or less my vote was not leading the chamber in the right direction that they wanted to go, and therefore they wanted to part ways with my services.
Do you think the leadership, the executive committee of the chamber, made their decision to dismiss you at the request of another Georgia politician?
You're going to have to interview the executive committee on that. I have no clue. I only know what they told me on the Zoom. It was a Zoom call.
Knowing everything you know now, would you have voted differently on SB 68?
I have no reservation. Why? I mean, I voted the way I voted. I mean,
even given
I wouldn't change that.
all the things that happened after your vote.
We got to vote on legislation, whether it's good or bad. You can't worry about whether you're going to lose some money in the budget or lose a chairmanship or whatever. You vote because of the legislation. And no, I feel comfortable the way I voted. I consider myself voting right on that bill. And I hope we come back and improve that bill.
Teresa Garcia Robertson, the Harris County Chamber of Commerce board chair, declined to comment on the reasons behind Smith's firing. Cody Hall, a senior advisor to Governor Brian Kemp, said that neither the governor or anyone acting on his behalf had any role whatsoever in the chamber's decision.
Well, time now for our political roundtable. Today we have Fal Sabak, Assistant Vice President at McGuire Woods Consulting and former Executive Director of the Georgia House Democratic Caucus, and Stephen Lawson, a Republican communications strategist who served as a senior communications advisor to House Speaker John Burns. He also worked for Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones and Congressman Mike Collins. Welcome to panel. We just heard a very interesting conversation with Zach, so I'll let you take away the first question.
Yeah, I think this is a good place to start. Tort reform was Governor Kemp's top legislative priority this session. Are we seeing some of the fallout now from some of the decisions, some of the votes that some state lawmakers cast? Stephen, I want to start with you.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think you're certainly seeing that. It was a tough vote for a lot of people, but it's important to back up when we talk about tort reform for your viewers, what this bill actually did. A lot of this was just common sense proposals, things in here. If you were suing someone in an auto accident, being able to know that whether or not you were wearing a seatbelt. If you own a business and someone comes onto your property and shoots someone else, you shouldn't be liable necessarily for that. So there were a lot of very common sense things in this bill. But look, at the end of the day, people had to vote their conscience. Obviously, I understand both sides of Representative Vance's argument. On the one hand, certainly I think it probably could have been handled a little better on a personnel level. It probably should have waited until after session. But at the same time, he had to know his employer was very interested and invested in this bill. It's what their members wanted. It's what his constituents wanted. And so at the end of the day, I think he walked into that vote potentially knowing what was going to happen.
Look, I mean, I think from the
we saw a lot of the business community reaching out, trying to get relief from the governor and from the state leadership. What we saw in the House mostly was the other side coming in to say, look, this bill is going to affect people's ability to sue if they had been raped, if they had been victims of sexual trafficking, of human trafficking. And that kind of was really the tone of the opposition at that point. So I think that, we saw the vote was incredibly close. I can't remember last time a vote was that close.
One vote margin.
It was a one vote margin. Yeah. You had 3 Democrats jump and vote for it. I do think that you will continue to see fallout as the session kind of goes on and then even into election season.
I want to ask you all about a vibe check because we love a vibe check on the Georgia vote. But first, I want to ask you about some more bipartisan action. Tort reform did become bipartisan, as you said. House Bill 428, an effort to codify IVF protections. It passed the Senate and the House. Val, do you think that this move could be a runway for other protections? We know since the Heartbeat bill passed, there's been a gray area for some doctors when they're dealing with abortion care.
I think to an extent, sure. I think that you'll see bills like this to codify, to protect IVF. I think that there was a bill that was dropped to help protect contraception, especially when we're dealing in a world post Roe v. Wade. I think that you will see certain things, but then on the other hand, you saw a hearing this week that would ban abortion totally. And so you kind of do get the both sides.
And I was going to ask Stephen about that. That's a good segue. There was a bill partisan by House Republicans to put a complete ban in Georgia. Is that going anywhere?
No, it's not. It was a hearing only. I think that's an important distinction there. But yeah, I think obviously IVF protections were really important. Obviously, that was a priority of House Speaker John Burns, received bipartisan support, passed out of the Senate. And as Val said, there was another bill dropped to protect contraception for women. I think those are great moves by Republicans, especially in a post-Roe world. And I think on top of being really good policy, they're also really smart politically.
Mm-hmm. We are coming up with about 60 seconds left in this segment. I think a good use of our time would be, we have 1 week left coming up in this legislative session. Number one thing you're watching for to happen over the next week, Stephen?
I think the budget negotiations are going to be very tense over the next week. Obviously, between the House and the Senate and the appropriations chairman there, they're very far apart right now, so it's going to be interesting to see how that gets brought in for a landing.
Mm-hmm. Val?
You have a few issues that are still kind of pending. You have a bunch of social legislation that's still out there, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, some of the anti-trans legislation is still out there. I heard another rumor about sports betting. I know I talked about that last time, so we'll see if that actually ends up going anywhere or not. And then there was a voting bill that was moving through this week. So I think that we are seeing some of those last minute measures trying to see if they still have life.
A lot to keep track of. Good news, the panel will be right back and we will talk about it all.
We're back with our panel here. Guys, let's do a little bit of tariff talk. There's been a lot of tariff talk coming from the Trump administration. We saw a 20% tariff on China, 25% on Mexico and Canada, a lot of different tariffs, some being pulled back, some not taking effect. But I want to talk about an auto tariff that was announced this week. 25% tariff on all foreign-made vehicles and car parts is expected to take effect in a couple days here. How could this impact Georgia's economy? As we know, we are trying to get into that business. We are in that business.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think there's a lot of auto manufacturers on edge a little bit. Obviously, we've got a significant car manufacturing presence here in Georgia between Kia and Hyundai. But again, I think this is probably part of a larger negotiation, art of the deal tactic from the Trump administration. It's going to be really interesting to watch how serious those get and how long they go, right? Because I think there's going to be a lot of lag time on prices going up on those cars.
Val?
And I mean, to the counter of that, I think that people are still hurting. People are still, living paycheck to paycheck. I think seeing those tariffs and depending on when the costs go up and how long it lasts, because they're trying to balance it back out eventually. But when is eventually?
When is eventually? That's
correct.
a big question that a lot of people are saying. Well, with that, thank you both so much for being here. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
We'll have more on the after hours version of Georgia Vote. Up next, our Voice of the Voter takes us to a movie theater in Brookhaven where a filmmaker is sharing her take on how elected officials are shaping the scene. We'll be right back. Well, today, our Voice of the Voter is taking us to the movies in Brookhaven, where we caught up with Greg Maurice, a movie executive at Film Hub, and Jennifer Pasima. They're giving us a front row seat to the growth and distribution of films by Black creators and sharing their take on how politics is directing the future of the movie industry.
How does a movie get from a producer or director making it to right here on the big screen?
So for us as a company, Film Hub, what we try to do is to help filmmakers understanding the distribution strategy.
So let's say somebody comes to you with an idea. They say, Greg, I have this great movie. It's going to be better than Spider-Man. What do you tell them?
Well, they all say that. They all say that. We'll talk to the filmmaker and trying to understand their expectations. I would talk to the buyers, to the networks, to see if they are interested.
I miss you.
The Despaired, it is currently on BET. It's a supernatural horror film about a young lady who she wants her husband back from the dead, and honestly, she touches into soul ties.
Why did you decide to seek out Greg?
You got to think of each title as property. So now BET is renting it, but who will rent it for the next season? As a filmmaker, you think all your films are going to make billions of dollars. I'd be like, God, this the one. This is the one. I'll be a billionaire. We going to make it.
What is your sense of just how our elected officials are running our country?
I was fine. I'm moving to Africa. It's like I'm joking. In a climate where we don't know what's going to happen today or tomorrow, I still believe God is on the throne.
It's a lot of distractions out there, and for me, what I can do is continue to put my head down and work and advocate for the community that I care about when it comes to representation.
What are you all most concerned about right now?
I'm concerned about making sure that projects continue to stay in Atlanta, especially since the wildfire in LA, and just being able to show we can do quality storytelling.
Most of the times, if you let yourself getting consumed by all this distraction, you're gonna be afraid or scared to take a chance or even licensing a Black title because you don't know what's happening.
What are you all most optimistic about?
With the Black cinema vertical is for us to be synonymous in our community, but for us as a distributor, that's why we want to put ourselves out there, for filmmakers to know about us.
He who holds the pen holds the power. If you sit down and you write, someone will come and want to see and read your work and produce your work. I'm optimistic about the plan, the blueprint to keep going.
She also said to filmmakers, aspiring filmmakers, think distribution before production.
Another great story, Faith. And for everyone who was on that program too, so good. And for everyone who is watching our program today, we're so grateful for you. We appreciate you watching us, and we hope to see you back here again next Sunday at 11 for another edition of The Georgia Vote.